On December 20th, 1944, a 21-year-old soldier from Wakanda, Illinois, made his last stand in the frozen forests of Belgium. His name was Richard "Bud" Froehlke. He was a private in the United States Army, and on that bitter winter morning, he and 4,900 other men were ordered to hold a 15-mile front against 3 full German divisions, knowing they could not win. What happened next would delay Hitler's last great offensive by 3 critical days. It would save the town of Bastogne. It would cost the 110th Infantry Regiment nearly everything. This is their story. This is Bud's story. And this is the story the world forgot. By November 1944, Nazi Germany was dying. In the east, Soviet armies were hammering toward Berlin. In the west, American, British, and Canadian forces had liberated France and were pushing toward the Rhine River. Victory seemed inevitable. It was only a matter of time. But time was Hitler's last weapon. On September 16, 1944, Adolf Hitler summoned his generals to the Wolf's Lair. He unveiled a plan so audacious, so desperate, that even his own commanders thought he had lost his mind. Codename Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. The plan was simple in concept, catastrophic in scale. Concentrate nearly every available tank, every reserve division, every last drop of fuel, and strike through the Ardennes forest. Split the Allied armies, recapture the port of Antwerp, force the British and Americans to negotiate peace. The Ardennes, 80 miles of dense forest, steep hills, narrow roads, and freezing rivers straddling the border of Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. The Allies considered it a quiet sector, too rugged for a major offensive. In May 1940, the Germans had thought the same thing. And then Hitler's panzers came roaring through, bypassing the Maginot Line, and France fell in 6 weeks. Now, in December 1944, Hitler was betting everything on one final throw of the dice, and standing directly in his path was the 28th Infantry Division. The Bloody Bucket, that's what the Germans called them, because of the red keystone shoulder patch they wore. Originally the Pennsylvania National Guard, the 28th had fought from Normandy to the German border. In November 1944, they had been mauled in the Hurtgen Forest, one of the bloodiest, most brutal battles in American history. They lost over 6,000 men. Entire companies were shattered. The division desperately needed rest. And so, in mid-November, they were sent to the Ardennes, the quiet sector. The 28th Infantry Division was ordered to hold a 25-mile front along the Our River in Luxembourg. 25 miles. That's 4 times the doctrinal width for a full-strength infantry division. And the 28th was not full strength. They were at 80% manning. Many of their officers and NCOs, the combat-experienced leaders, were dead or wounded. Replacements were arriving daily, kids straight from stateside training, 19 and 20 years old, who had never heard a shot fired in anger. 3 regiments were spread impossibly thin along that frozen river. To the north, the 112th Infantry. To the south, the 109th. And in the center, holding the most critical sector, the direct road to Bastogne, was the 110th Infantry Regiment. They were responsible for a 10.5-mile front, with only 2 battalions on the line. The 3rd was held in reserve. 5,000 men, spread across 5 fortified villages, Hosingen, Weiler, Marnac, Munchausen, and the regimental headquarters at Clairvaux. Facing them, hidden in the forests across the Our River, were 27,000 German soldiers, 3 full divisions, 216 tanks and assault guns, and they were all aimed at one objective, Bastogne. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944, 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire. The earth shook. For 30 minutes, high-explosive shells rained down on the American positions. Telephone lines were cut instantly. Communication with battalion headquarters gone. Radio antenna shredded. In the village of Weiler,
Private Froehlke and the men of Company I, 3rd Battalion, 110th Infantry, huddled in their foxholes as the world exploded around them. And then, through the smoke and the snow and the fog, they came. At 6 a.m., German assault troops crossed the Our River in rubber boats. Quietly, skillfully, they infiltrated through the snow-covered draws, moving like ghosts through the forest. By dawn, they had surrounded every American strongpoint: Hosingen, Weiler, Marnac, Munchausen, Holztham, Clairvaux. And then the attacks began. In Hosingen, Company K of the 110th was hit by an entire German battalion. Hundreds of Volksgrenadiers swarmed the village from 3 sides, but Captain Frederick Feiker and his men held. They held because they had no choice. They held because that's what infantrymen do. In Weiler, Private Froehlke's Company I faced repeated human wave attacks from the German 26th Volksgrenadier Division. The Americans were so outnumbered that the Germans twice requested ceasefires under a white flag to collect their wounded. Twice the Americans granted it, and twice, after the stretcher-bearers left, the attacks resumed. At Marnac, the critical road junction that led straight to Clairvaux and then to Bastogne, Company B of the 110th faced the full weight of the German 2nd Panzer Division. After the war, the commander, Colonel Meinrad von Lauckert, would write, "During the first attacks on Marnac, we found that all our preliminary fire had no effect. The American soldiers there defended the village foolhardily and with a never-experienced defiance of death." But defiance doesn't stop panzers. By midday on December 16, 1944, the Germans had completed bridges across the Our River. Armor began rolling west, Mark IV and Panther tanks, self-propelled assault guns. The American positions, already surrounded, already cut off, now faced an enemy that outnumbered them 10-1. At his headquarters in Clairvaux, Colonel Hurley Fuller, commander of the 110th Infantry, tried desperately to understand what was happening. All communications with his forward companies were dead. He had no idea how many Germans he was facing. He had no reinforcements, and he had orders from higher headquarters: hold at all costs.
Hold at all costs. That's an easy order to give. It's a different thing entirely to obey it when you know you cannot win. By dawn on December 17th, the 110th Infantry Regiment was fighting for its life. Every strong point was surrounded. Every village was an island in a sea of German armor. There would be no rescue. There would be no withdrawal. There would only be resistance. At Hosingen, Captain Feiker's Company K was still holding. They had been under continuous attack for 24 hours. Ammunition was running low. Food was gone. The wounded lay in cellars with no medical supplies. Outside, German tanks prowled the streets, firing point-blank into buildings. But Hosingen did not fall. In Marnac, the situation was desperate. The village had become a moonscape of rubble and craters. German infantry stormed in from the east, while panzers hammered the defenders from the north. At 10 a.m., Colonel Fuller ordered the 2nd Battalion, his only reserve, to counterattack and retake Marnac. It was a disaster. As the 2 rifle companies advanced from Clairvaux toward Marnac, they ran headlong into the 2nd Panzer Division rolling west. The Americans were slaughtered. Tanks fired at point-blank range. Mortars bracketed the infantry. Within minutes, the counterattack collapsed. The survivors fell back to a ridge east of Clairvaux, where they were immediately surrounded. By noon, Marnac had fallen. The road to Clairvaux was open. And now the full weight of the German offensive turned toward the regimental headquarters. Clairvaux, a medieval town built in a steep river valley dominated by an ancient castle. It was here that Colonel Fuller had established his command post, in the Hotel Clairvalis, near the vital bridge over the Clairve River. And it was here that the men of the 110th would make their last stand. At 9:30 a.m. on December 17th, German forces attacked Clairvaux from multiple directions. Panzer IVs descended the winding road from Marnac. Panzer Grenadiers infiltrated from the east. American tank destroyers and a handful of Sherman tanks engaged the Germans in a desperate street battle. 14 American Shermans were destroyed. The Germans lost only 4 tanks.
By evening, German armor was rolling through the town. The Clèves River Bridge, the key to Bastogne, was in enemy hands. At the Hotel Clairvalis, Colonel Fuller and his headquarters staff found themselves surrounded. Fuller requested permission to withdraw. It was denied. At the castle, Captain Clark Mackey of the Regimental Headquarters Company and about 100 men barricaded themselves inside the thick stone walls. They had rifles, a few machine guns, and a handful of bazookas. Outside, German tanks circled like wolves. From the castle towers, American riflemen fired down at the German infantry, inflicting heavy casualties. A German report stated, "Especially from an old fortress tower, the Americans fired with towering rage so that our infantrymen couldn't advance without bad casualties."
All through the night of December 17th, the Americans held. In the castle, in isolated houses, in basements and cellars. Colonel Fuller, unable to escape, moved through the town helping wounded soldiers before finally slipping out through a third-story window and escaping down a cliff using a steel ladder. On the morning of December 18th, the Germans set fire to Clairvaux Castle. The defenders, out of ammunition, out of water, with no hope of relief, surrendered. Captain Mackey and the survivors were marched into captivity. The 110th Infantry Regiment headquarters had ceased to exist. But across the 110th sector, isolated groups of Americans were still fighting. At Hosingen, Company K held out until the afternoon of December 18th, 60 hours after the offensive began, before being overwhelmed. At Munshausen, Company C and the Regimental Cannon Company fought house to house, barricading streets with overturned trucks, until they too were finally surrounded and destroyed. Survivors filtered west toward the division command post at Wiltz. There, the remnants of the 3rd Battalion, about 200 men, joined a desperate defense led by Division Commander General Norman Cota himself. On December 19th, Wiltz fell. The soldiers who could escape, escaped. Those who couldn't fought to the end. By December 20th, 1944, the 110th Infantry Regiment had been annihilated as a fighting force. Of the 5,000 men who began the battle on December 16th, fewer than 500 remained. Company after company had been wiped out. Entire battalions had ceased to exist. The casualty lists would fill pages. Private Richard Bud Froehlke, 21 years old, from Wauconda, Illinois, was killed in action on December 20th, 1944. We don't know exactly where. We don't know exactly how. The records are incomplete. The chaos was total. What we do know is that he never stopped fighting. He was buried temporarily in a battlefield grave. Later, his remains were recovered and interred at Henri-Chapelle American Cemetery in Belgium, Plot G, Row 1, Grave 61. He rests there today, among 7,987 other American soldiers who fell in the Battle of the Bulge and the push into Germany. Hitler's timetable called for the capture of Bastogne on December 16th, the first day. The town fell on December 20th, 4 days late, and by then the 101st Airborne Division had arrived. The siege of Bastogne would become legendary. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's one-word reply to a German surrender demand, "Nuts," would echo through history. But the 101st Airborne only reached Bastogne in time because of the men who died buying those 4 days. The 110th Infantry Regiment was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for its actions from December 16th through 23rd. The citation reads, in part, "By sacrificing themselves, the officers and men of the 110th Infantry Regiment bought the precious time needed for the 101st Airborne Division to consolidate its defenses at Bastogne." The story of Bastogne is well known, but it was only possible with the sacrifice of those American soldiers to the east. After the war, historians would call the Battle of the Bulge the greatest American battle of World War II. Over 600,000 American soldiers fought in the Ardennes. 19,000 were killed, 89,000 casualties in total. It was the bloodiest single battle in American military history.
The Germans suffered between 80,000 and 100,000 casualties. Two panzer armies, desperately needed on the Eastern Front, were shattered. The Luftwaffe lost hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft. Germany's last mobile reserves were gone. Hitler's gamble had failed, and the road to Berlin was open. But for the men of the 110th Infantry Regiment, the aftermath was bittersweet. On December 23rd, Colonel Daniel Strickler, the new regimental commander, established a command post at New Chateau and began the grim task of reorganization. 500 men, that's all that remained, 500 out of 5,000. Over the next month, reinforcements arrived, new lieutenants, new sergeants, new privates who had never heard of Hosingen or Weiler or Marnac or Clairvaux. By mid-January 1945, the 110th Infantry was back in the line, but it was not the same regiment. It could never be the same regiment. The men who died in those 5 villages, Hosingen, Weiler, Marnac, Munshausen, Clairvaux, have largely been forgotten by history. They were not at Normandy. They were not at the Bulge's famous battles like Bastogne or St. Vith. They were at places most people have never heard of, small villages with unpronounceable names on the Belgian-Luxembourg border. But the people who live there remember. In Hosingen, there is a memorial to Company K, 110th Infantry. In Marnac, a plaque honors the 707th Tank Battalion and the infantrymen who defended the village. In Clairvaux, the castle, rebuilt after the war, contains a museum dedicated to the Battle of the Bulge. And every year, on December 16th, the villagers gather to remember the Americans who saved them. For Richard Froehlke's family, his parents, Philip and Wanda, his sister Lorraine, the war ended with a telegram. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your son, Private Richard P. Froehlke, was killed in action. 21 years old, his whole life ahead of him, gone in the frozen forests of Belgium. After the war, his parents had a choice, bring their son home to Illinois or let him rest among his brothers-in-arms in Belgium. They chose Belgium. Plot G, Row 1, Grave 61. He would not come home, but he would not be alone. Today, Henri-Chapelle American Cemetery is maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission. The grounds are immaculate. The marble crosses gleam in the sun. 7,987 American soldiers are buried here. 450 more are memorialized on the walls of the missing, men whose bodies were never recovered. The cemetery is open every day except Christmas and New Year's, and every day visitors come, grandchildren of veterans, history students, travelers from around the world, and they walk among the graves and they remember. Private Richard Bud Froehlke was born in Wauconda, Illinois on October 28, 1923. He grew up during the Great Depression. He graduated high school just as the world went to war. He enlisted in the Army because that's what young men did in 1943. He trained as an infantryman. He shipped overseas. He joined the 110th Infantry Regiment, 28th Infantry Division, the Bloody Bucket. And on a frozen December morning in 1944, when the order came to hold the line, he held. We don't know if Bud was afraid. We don't know his last thoughts. We don't know if he knew in those final moments that his sacrifice would matter. But it did matter. Every hour the 110th held was an hour the Germans didn't reach Bastogne. Every German tank destroyed was one less tank threatening the Meuse River crossings. Every German casualty inflicted was one more delay in Hitler's timetable. By the time the 110th Infantry ceased to exist as a fighting force, the Allies had recognized the scale of the German offensive and were rushing reinforcements to the Ardennes. The 82nd Airborne, the 101st Airborne, the 9th and 10th Armored Divisions, Patton's Third Army was pivoting north. The Germans would never reach Antwerp, they would barely reach the Meuse, and by January 25, 1945, the Bulge had been eliminated. The war would be over in 4 months. The 110th Infantry Regiment's stand at the Ore River and the Clairvaux River was one of the classic defensive actions in American military history. They faced 3 German divisions with 5,000 men. They were outnumbered 5-1, outgunned, surrounded, cut off, and they held for 3 days. They held because they were soldiers. They held because those were their orders. They held because the men beside them were helding. Plot G, Row 1, Grave 61. His name is carved into white marble. Richard P. Froehlke, Illinois, Private,
110th Infantry Regiment, 28th Infantry Division, December 20th, 1944, age 21. Next to his name, carved into the stone, is a small cross, and beneath that, the words every soldier hopes will be true. Here rests in honored glory. 80 years ago, Private Richard Bud Froehlke and 5,000 men of the 110th Infantry Regiment stood between Nazi Germany's last offensive and the Allied advance toward victory. They could not hold forever. They were not expected to survive, but they bought the time. They paid the price. And because of them, Bastogne held, the Bulge was crushed, and the road to Berlin remained open. This is their story. This is Bud's story. And as long as we remember, they will never be forgotten.